Hi everyone, today a tutorial about increasing on a loom, on a flexee loom. I'll explain it in this video and also in other videos on this channel. I'll give you some more information about possibilities to increase on a loom. In this video an explanation on how you can do it on a round loom, so for example with a hat. That you go from a brim with less stitches to the main hat actually with more stitches. This technique can also be used when you are knitting a sleeve and then you are knitting it back and forth. So from the brim you also increase to the sleeve and actually to the main stitch. So you can apply this method to multiple projects. Further on in the video you will see what this technique can do with a hat, for example. If you search on the internet and you search for example on make one, you will also find videos which shows you that you increase from one stitch, and this is how you usually do that. Then you actually put that stitch on the peg in between. This is usually better if you do that on a side edge, so when you end your row or begin your row. If you do that in between two stitches, then you will get a little bit more of a hole over there, and of course you don't want that. If you are increasing hat or color of a sweater, that you want to make it even a little bit bigger towards the other stitch of the rest of the project. Brims, especially when they are knitted in rib stitch, are often a bit more elastic than the main stitch, and that can be a knit stitch, than the sweater or hat itself. I'm now assuming it's a sweater just to give you an example. You start with the brim, and very often you see in needle patterns that you make a brim with 100 stitches and then you increase to 120 stitches to make the rest of your sweater. And this method could be a nicer method for increasing the number of stitches, and that is actually also due to the elasticity of the brim. I will show it to you by using a hat as an example. I had made this hat with 66 stitches in rib stitch, and I continued with 66 stitches in main stitch. You see that brim actually has a lot more stretch than the stitch I use. So actually the main stitch, and that's purl and knit, that's because of the elasticity. At a certain point you will notice that the hat could have been a little tighter. Then you can say I knit the whole hat in a smaller stitch, or you knit with less stitches. But you can also say, for example, because it fits well at the head, then I'll adjust the brim a little. In this video I'm going to show you how to increase from 58 rib stitches to 66 stitches for the main stitch, so the rest of the hat. 56 stitches is the closest. I have to increase 8 stitches, so 7 times I have to increase. I've put a marker everywhere where I want to increase, equally divided, and that's the best and nicest way. Meanwhile, I have knitted 8 rows for that brim, and then I'm going to increase my stitches. Of course I can do that because I'm going to use the intermediate stitch and then put it on, and with an E-wrap you might be able to do that, but with a U-wrap you can't. It's just too tight, and that's what you're going to notice, by the way. So I have to create space for this new, actually in between stitch we are going to create. Well, how I am going to do that? I'm going to do that in a row before I'm going to increase. And how do you do that? And you knit to the spot where you want to increase a stitch. You can determine that in advance. Here I want to increase one stitch, then you knit the stitch and you give it an extra wrap and you continue in pattern. So this is the stitch, you wrap it once and you continue in pattern. So whenever or whatever, and in this row we were doing or knitting a rib stitch. So the only thing you have to do here, regardless of that stitch you are knitting at that moment, and that will be a knit stitch one time and a purl stitch the next time, you are going to add an extra wrap to the back or stitch, and you are going to do that anywhere you want to, a whole row or a part of a row. Suppose you want to knit a sleeve in round. Look here, I said this is my beginning back, then it's the most beautiful to increase always 1, 2 or 2 stitches from this beginning back, so that you always have one stitch in between those two you want to increase. And with the sleeve you actually increase on both sides of the sleeve, and in round this is also possible. But then you have to determine a kind of spot from where you are going to do the increases that are still on both sides. So then you would or could have to make an increase here and or here. Then you could either choose to make a wrap over there. In itself, that's not that bad way you do it, because you can always remove it by removing the wrap. Decide for yourself where you want it to be. I'll show you what happens when you take that wrap off, and then how you can move it to the spot where you want it. This is when you do it in the round, but of course you can also do it with back and forth knitting, so knitting it as a flat panel. And also then you can decide where you want to have your increases. I'll show you that later on in the video as well. In the meantime, I have finished my row, which I have to do before, the row with increases, so the one with the wraps. And please check if you have made the extra wraps around it, because believe me, you really need it. That's to create that extra space in between. And okay, it happens of course that you forget the wrap, and then there's also or always a small solution possible, but mostly you will see it, and that's because of the stitches around it. You made those smaller because of that, and because of that part is a little bit tightened up, you can see it in your project. Yeah, and most of the time we're the only one who see it, but not another person. I continue in the knit stitch, and that's the row after the rib stitch, and I will knit up to my marker, and that's the stitch or the back where a stitch and a wrap will be. Maybe you've already decreased, then you also know that you have to move a number of stitches to get that decrease. If you try this a few times, I'm sure you will be able to do this as well. Okay, what you do, you see 2 stitches here, then you remove the wrap. And as you can see, here's a larger loop now in between 2 pegs, and between those 2 pegs or stitches you are going to make that increase. So you are going to use the in-between bar or the connection between 2 stitches to create a new stitch. Sometimes it's handy to put this loop on a stitch holder or cable needle, whatever you have. And especially when you do this for the first time, then it's clearly visible for you. We're going to take that off now. You're going to knit the next stitch, and you are going to take the flexee links apart. nice and gently, and just the way you are used to. And after trying this for a few times, you have to discover what is best for you. Either put it on the left or on the right side of the flexee links. And you will notice you can't put them together yet, because you have put it a link with 2 pegs to it. So you will have to knit a few stitches before you can put those links back together. You take the loop and you put it on, or you put it back on again with a twist, with a wrap. And now you see all this tend to loop out gigantic. Knitting has everything to do with tension. So you already adjust it. Just look at the tension here. It's a little harder than increasing, for example, but in itself it has to be possible to do it. Then of course you have to make a knit stitch over here instead of a purl stitch like I'm doing here, because you were knitting your first row in knit stitch. So you put it back again, you make a knit stitch, and you are going to move them already. So you move them 1 peg, and because of the stretch of your knitting and because you already move the stitches, you will be able to put back the links together. You don't have to pay attention that much to your tension right now, so you knit a couple of stitches and then you just check if it is right to put them back on. And you see what happens here. You have too much tension. The only thing you do now is adjust that, and you adjust that, the tension, to the other stitches. So you look at what kind of tension those have, and you'll see that soon enough. And you also see here, you are actually looking at what is happening to that in-between stitch. How much tension you have given it. I'll also show you this step by step now, and then you actually see what happens, and later on in the video you'll see a method that makes things a lot easier. The most important thing is that you pay attention to your tension, and so just keep on adjusting the stitches in the meantime. And now you continue knitting the next stitches, and every stitch you knit you move 1 peg back, and you actually do this until your second increase, and then in the meantime you adjust your tension again, of course, like here. You see 1 peg in between, then you knit your next stitch and you move it. In a few moments we are going to do the second decrease, and then you will already notice that it will be a lot easier, because we already have 1 peg in between. So here's the wrap. You take that one off, put it on a stitch holder, you knit the stitch and you move it. And as you can see, we have an empty peg over here. So you put the stitch back on the hook and around the peg. You twist it around it. Actually, just like a wrap, like you would do a knee wrap stitch. Every now and then you will notice that that wrap stitch is a little bit tighter than the other stitches, and you knit it and you continue knitting. Well, this one goes a lot smoother, more flexible. We're working on the flexee. Increases this way are actually only possible on the flexee, or you might have an adjustable loom, so you can do it on certain spots as well. But then you are limited to usually 4 corners, or you have to move a lot of stitches. I will show it to you one more time, And yeah, actually I do that because then you can see you can do it certain ways. Just see for yourself what's convenient for you. So you put it on a stitch holder, you have a look at where you want the increase, and you put a flexee link in between. Notice this is the intermediate strand, and this one, the connection between two stitches, and we are going to create a new stitch with it. So you actually use the in-between barn of a previous row to increase. And I make a wrap around the peg, and that's because then you get less holes. Would I just put it around the loom, so the way you took it off the stitch holder, and you just lay it around, yeah, over the peg, then you actually create a larger stitch over there, so you get a hole. You pay attention to your tension again. I could already try to attach them, those links, to each other, but most of the time that ain't possible yet. It also depends on your yarn. You knit your next stitch and put it next to the increases. You have to remove the stitch from the peg, of course. You knit the next stitch and put it on a peg towards your increases. Just until you have enough space and actually tension to put those links together. Especially in the beginning when the flexee is still new, you will notice that you have to put a little more effort into it. But after a few times you will notice that it becomes a lot more flexible. So then it will be easier to connect them when there is enough space to put them back together. At this spot you can also see where you have increased. Look here, you see one knit stitch on your knit part. In your purl part you see one stitch as well, and at the knit part here you see two stitches. That's where you have created the new stitch. Adjust your tension again, because otherwise you will see a different tension in your project. You are actually observing what the intermediate bars or strands or your other stitches look like, and you kindly copy that. This is also a bit of kind of feeling, so you adjust the tension in the meantime nicely. That is actually also what you do in this row with all the increases you do continuously. Pay attention to your tension, because you're also moving the stitches one peg. Also there can be a different intention, so right there on a certain spot you can see that you've increased there. I personally like to straighten out that flexee while I'm knitting, because it gives you a good view at your tension, but you also create the same kind of stitch by doing it that way. You can see the strands in between here, you can see what kind of tension it is on it, and look, you can pull it on a little bit by looping it through. And if you observe those increases, it's actually done in pairs. The first one is a bit more difficult, and the second one, that one is easier. Now you can put them in between, because you actually have moved the first stitch. And then you get an empty peg. That is why it's a bit easier, because you don't have to put a link in between. Unfortunately, there are no odd links yet. You grab your intermediate strand or bar and you wrap it around the peg, and you knit again, either towards the end of your row or towards your next spot of increasing. And the wrapped one you knit nice and gently. Also make sure you keep an even number of stitches. So start with an even number and also have an even number of increases. Otherwise you will have a peg left over, or you miss one at some point. You can adjust that as well, but it's easier to do it like this. Just keep checking your tension. If you discover that there's one of which you can see a different intention in between, you divide it over the surrounding pegs by very quietly pulling it through. Quietly and gently. And what I'm showing here, the looping of the stitches, imagine you realize at the spot where you'd like to increase that you have forgotten the wrap in the previous row, then you can actually create extra space by looping through the stitches to still make that wrap. And so you create a nice transition between a brim and the rest of the project. And after knitting a number of rows, you can also see that this part is quite tense, so it's pretty tight. There's increased total of 8 stitches, and you see here what the flexee does. It tries to adjust that tension by pulling at the project. Well, while you're knitting, you adjust that back again, of course, so the stitches continue to get the same tension when you knit them. Especially in the first few rows, you will notice that it is this way by now, so in an angle, and then you can simply straighten it and continue knitting. And I also advise you to really straighten the loom because it's a flexible loom. The moment you start knitting a stitch here in the corner, you have a small different impact distance, which you don't have at the moment you straighten the loom, because you want to have the same stitch tension everywhere, and not that the one is bigger and that the other one is smaller. So the same tension on your project, so that it looks nice and regular, and that is fortunately possible with this loom. So keep it straight. And then you find out that that wrap, and you have made in the row before, is not on the spot where you want it to be. Then there is no need to worry. Then you can adjust it or remove it to the spot where you want it to be. So then you are going to loop it through to the spot where you want it to be. You do that as follows. Officially, I would like to have it in between those two pegs, but it's actually in between here now. The only thing you do then, you loop the yarn through by just wrapping the stitch and pull at it. Then you take a good look in between those two stitches where you can find the intermediate strand between the two stitches, so the connection between peg 1 and peg 2, or stitch 1 and stitch 2. You see it here. That's the last stitch of the previous row. Here you see it, a kind of looping through. So this is the strand or bar in between the two stitches, and this one is the one you are going to use for the increase. You see that loop of the previous row, and you see the in-between loop through, and that's what you pull at. And this is the one you are going to put on the empty peg. So in this example I have to move my first stitch because I'm knitting it as a flat panel. So I'm creating my own empty peg. So now you see that I didn't twist it. I told you before that in the video, if you do it like this, then you get a bit bigger hole here. So you grab it off again and you turn it around as much as possible. That doesn't always work, of course, as you can see here. It's a good thing that it happens now, so I can show you how you can adjust that. You twist it, and if necessary you put your thumbnail, and you wrap it. You divide the stitch by putting your thumbnail to it for a moment, and then you wrap the stitch around it. And now you have increased where you want to have an increase. And of course you can also do that when the wrap have been there. Then you loop it through nice and gently, and you just look here at those in-between stitches. How big are they? And you can see it from the tension on the peg as well, from the stitch on the peg as well. Yes, it's actually just a kind of getting a feeling with it. The stitches may be a little slider, but shouldn't be so tight that the stitches can be knitted over, because that's what you're going to see in your project. That's why I'm making this wrap. that you don't really have to pull at the fabric, and that's why it's actually continues neatly in your project without you noticing that these stitches just get smaller or much bigger. So it gets the same tension as the rest of the stitches of your project. As you can see here, they all have the same tension. So by wrapping this stitch, the new stitch, you get the same tension everywhere. And now I show it as an increase on the side of your project, but this is also applicable when you're knitting in the round. Now this is the hat with the somewhat smaller brim, where you have increased. As you can see on the inside, it is actually almost impossible to see you have done that. Advantages of that is, because it's often the case that this part of the hat fits well because of a certain stitch, and that the brim is actually just a little bit too loose because it's a little bit more elastic, and then sometimes it's better to make the brim part smaller or narrower. So less stitches for the brim. I also show you the difference. It can just be a size difference. You see this one, you can stretch quite a bit, and this one is a bit less stretchy. That's why it fits better on your head. And there are more ways of making a brim smaller than the head part, but that's in other videos. Yes, and often there you will find out that you have knitted a project because you usually start at the brim. But okay, with these hats you might decide to make a smaller brim with the next one, and then you're going to increase. And like I said, there are more ways that lead to Rome. This is this way I have shown you. This is very easy to do on the flexee, and I just showed you that. You increase, but you can also do this on a nifty knitter. Then you start on a 31 loom, you put the stitches on a circular needle, and then you are going to transfer them to a 36 loom, so a kind of loom jump. There are some videos on this channel about how you can make a brim tighter, smaller, and then with such a somewhat more rigid loom, like the nifty knitter is, so to speak, because at that moment you can put more than 31 or 36 stitches on the nifty knitter. And soon, or now, maybe already, there will be some videos on the channel, and if you have indeed knitted a rather tricky pattern and you don't like your brim, you can say, or just say, I'm not going to frog that whole head, but I'm just going to put a different kind of brim to it. So I'll just show you here what your possibilities are to change a brim as well. And you can see that this brim actually is going more inwards, while this brim is going more outwards, the hat. So it's almost outside the hat. But anyway, these are all little tricks to make a hat so that it actually perfectly fits. Now I will show you on a mannequin what the difference is. This is the hat with a narrower brim, so less stitches for the brim, and then you see that there is almost a hand in between. It fits nicely with the rest of the hat as well. If you have the other one, so where the brim has the same number of stitches as the hat itself, then you see that's quite wide. That in itself is not bad, of course, because the hat itself stops that. But you can make a choice to match the hat even better to your head. In my case, the hat with the smaller brim fitted much better on my head. So less stitches for the brim. This was it for this time, so increases evenly divided in one row to make a project perfectly fit. Thanks for watching and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.